So good afternoon again and welcome to Medetomidine in the new era of synthetic street drugs. Today we have with us Fernando Montero of Columbia University, and we can go ahead and progress to the next slide. So this event is brought to you in collaboration with the Central East Addiction Technology Transfer Center under the Cooperative Agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, known as SAMHSA. And this next slide is going to give you a little bit of insight into who we are and what we do, just in case you aren't familiar with us. Looks like the sound isn't working this time. Let's see. We may have to reshare.
Oh, maybe I need to turn on my audio.
The Addiction Technology Transfer Center Network is here to help. Since 1993, we've been the leading experts providing free training, tools, and support for professionals in substance use disorder treatment and recovery services. When we say technology, we don't mean electronics. For us, technology means an innovation, protocol, research-based practice, or other scientific advancement. We transfer or disseminate the technology in real-world settings to benefit the community. To access our free resources and learn more, visit attcnetwork.org today.
All right, we can go to the next slide. All right, so we are now live and we are being recorded, so we ask that you please remain mute unless prompted to unmute. Any questions for myself or Dr. Montero, you may use the Q&A feature as well as the chat. I will be monitoring and communicating with everyone as we progress today. If there are any technical difficulties for any reason, someone gets kicked out or Zoom is acting a little weird, I am putting my email in the chat. And once I turn my photo off, you'll see tech in my profile, so you can reach out to me in the chat as well if anything goes wrong. But
thank you. Thanks to Aisha and to the ATTC for the invitation. My name is Fernando Montero. I'm a medical anthropologist. For the past 17 years, I have been doing research among people who use drugs, as well as among people who sell drugs, predominantly in Philadelphia and in Puerto Rico, to understand how drug supply chains change and the public health impact of the transformations in the drug supply in the United States. Most of my research has been in the neighborhood of Kensington in Philadelphia, where I lived between 2008 and 2012, and where I happened to just move back. I just moved again 2 weeks ago to conduct further research. I generally start this presentation by thinking broadly about the history of the street drug supply in the United States. The ultimate purpose of this presentation is to understand medetomidine, which is a new adulterant that has infiltrated the street opioid supply. But I insist that it's very important to understand the history of the drug supply at the street level to understand all the transformations that have happened over the past 12 years. A lot has happened over the past 12 years in the United States in terms of the street opioid supply. Fentanyl emerged, xylazine emerged, and more recently, adulterants like medetomidine and another substance known as BTEMs have entered the supply. And each of these substances have a different impact on public health and on the way that people actually use drugs on an everyday basis, right? So we're going to walk through all those transformations to understand how medetomidine entered the supply and the impact it's having on the health of people who use drugs. So I started this presentation in 1991 because that's a year that something very important happened in the opioid supply of the United States. In 1991, which is basically the heroin era, the heyday of the heroin era in the United States when heroin was still around. 1991, the heroin market in the United States split into two. Regional markets became very clearly distinguished into the heroin market west of the Mississippi and the heroin market east of the Mississippi. West of the Mississippi, heroin markets were monopolized by a form of heroin known as black tar. This is the only type of heroin that you could really reliably find on the streets of California, San Francisco, Arizona, New Mexico, Washington, Oregon states. East of the Mississippi, you could only find a powdered heroin that was of Colombian origin that was off-white and that would turn brown when mixed with water prior to injection, right? These types of heroin were very different. Powder heroin and black tar heroin were different chemically. They had very different textures, material characteristics, and those differences in the material characteristics of these two types of heroin had huge impact on the health of people who use drugs. Anthropologists and epidemiologists studied these differences in the 1990s and 2000s, and they found that people who injected drugs on the West Coast had lower rates of HIV and hepatitis C than people who injected drugs on the East Coast. And they found that the reason for those differences had everything to do with the different types of heroin that people were using on either side of the country. People who were injecting drugs on the West Coast were dealing with black tar, which was a very difficult substance to handle. It was gooey, waxy, sometimes solid. It would clog syringes very easily. So if you wanted to reuse a syringe, and remember, this is the 1990s and early 2000s when needle exchange or syringe service programs were even more scarce than they are now. So it was harder for people to obtain sterile syringes. So people needed to reuse syringes and share syringes much more frequently than they do today. But if you wanted to reuse a syringe to inject black tar, you by force, like by necessity, had to repeatedly flush the syringe with water to avoid clogging, right? Also, black tar needed to be heated to be dissolved in water because it was this waxy, solid substance, right? So the act of heating the heroin solution, and most importantly, the act of repeatedly flushing the syringe with water, if you wanted to reuse or share a syringe, had the ultimate impact of lowering the rates of HIV and hepatitis C among people who injected drugs, right? Which is very interesting. On the East Coast, on the other hand, we always had this powdered heroin that dissolved very easily in water that did not clog syringes. People did not need to flush syringes repeatedly with water if they wanted to reuse a syringe or needed to reuse a syringe. They did not need to use heat. In fact, in Philadelphia, where I do most of my work, I have never seen anybody use heat to dissolve or to prepare a heroin solution or an opioid solution. And that had the effect of increasing the rates of hepatitis C and HIV among people who injected drugs on the East Coast during those years, right? So this is why it's so important to pay attention to the details of the substances that people are using, the material characteristics, the ultimate effects, how the material characteristics of a substance influence the way that people actually consume, right? Beyond the question of individual responsibility. This has nothing to do with individual responsibility. Black tar forces you to flush the syringe with water, right? Forces you to use heat. You have to really pay attention to these details to understand how people are using drugs and the health outcomes associated to substance use, right? It's not enough to say that people are using heroin. That doesn't mean anything. There are different types of heroin with different material characteristics. Each of the new adulterants that we're going to talk about have different material characteristics that are going to influence all these things, right? So that's what you have to pay attention to. Fentanyl began to emerge in 2013. Fentanyl is by now an old story. Some people think it's relatively recent. It's not, right? Fentanyl has been around for over a decade. Uh, and interestingly, it originally emerged on the East Coast. And the reason for that, again, has to do with the pre-existing differences in the heroin market across the country. Fentanyl as a powder could only be incorporated into the powdered forms of heroin that we already had on the East Coast. It could not be incorporated into the black tar form of heroin, that solid waxy substance that predominated on the West Coast. And in fact, black tar was never significantly found to contain fentanyl. Fentanyl was strictly an East Coast problem, right? Sometimes people imagine that fentanyl is this kind of like universal phenomenon that took over the entire country everywhere at the same time. That's absolutely not the case. Fentanyl spread was regionally uneven, and that unevenness had everything to do with the pre-existing state, the pre-existing distinctions in the heroin market geographically across the United States. Xylazine followed a very similar trajectory to fentanyl. Xylazine emerged as a powdered adulterant. And again, it could only be easily incorporated into the powdered forms of opioids that we already had on the East Coast. Not surprisingly, the first place where it was significantly detected in the opioid supply was Philadelphia, right? Followed very quickly by nearby US states, Maryland, Delaware, and so on and so forth, right? Of course, New Jersey, Camden, across the river from Philadelphia, very quickly takes on many of the characteristics that Philadelphia first displays. It took many years, again, for xylazine to begin to spread west, again, because of the fact that xylazine could not be incorporated into the black tar forms of heroin that predominated on the West Coast. By 2020, however, the entire opioid supply of the United States had fundamentally transformed. Heroin by that point had completely disappeared. It's almost impossible to find heroin in the country anymore. Nobody has a consistent supply of heroin anymore. If they tell you that they do, they're most likely misinformed, potentially lying. I have my own drug checking program in Philadelphia. We collect drug samples from people on the street, and we send them to a laboratory for chemical analysis. And we have only found 2 samples containing heroin in a year and a half of sample collection. And we have gone back to the corner where we were able to obtain those heroin samples the following week, and the heroin by then had disappeared. They were back to selling fentanyl combined with xylazine and medetomidine, right? And this is true pretty much everywhere in the country. Heroin is simply not around. When people are consuming opioids, they're consuming fentanyl because they cannot find anything else, right? When you hear that people say that they like fentanyl, it's most likely because that's the only opioid around, not because they love it, have any sort of, not because fentanyl has any addictive properties that are more potent than heroin's. That's an important myth that needs to be dispelled. Fentanyl is not more addictive than heroin. They're both equally likely to produce a dependence. But fentanyl is simply the only opioid around. Most of the time on the East Coast, fentanyl now is mixed with xylazine and medetomidine. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. An important phenomenon to keep in mind as we think about all these changes also is the increasing use of stimulants throughout the United States. This is a nationwide phenomenon. Our region here, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, is not alone in this. The use of methamphetamine and cocaine has exploded everywhere in the country. Overdoses related to the use of those stimulants have increased exponentially in every single US region. And that has a lot to do with what's happening in the opioid supply. People many times are using stimulants to counteract the deep sedation that they experience as a result of the transformations to the opioid supply. We're going to talk about that in more detail later on. So the first significant transformation that needs to be understood in order to understand xylazine and medetomidine is the emergence of fentanyl, right? There's something very important about fentanyl that needs to be taken into account when trying to understand later transformations to the opioid supply. I insist that it is very important to think of fentanyl beyond the question of potency. Most of the time, when you hear about fentanyl, all that you hear is that it is more potent than heroin. And it is true that it binds more powerfully to mu opioid receptors in the central nervous system, with the consequence of depressing and weakening a person's breathing much more than heroin, right? This is why it's more likely for a person to die of a fentanyl overdose than a heroin overdose. Fentanyl depresses a person's breathing much more than heroin. As you all know, this is what causes an opioid overdose. A person stops breathing and they die. This is very different than a stimulant overdose. When a person overdoses from cocaine or methamphetamine, they're dying of a stroke or a heart attack. It's very different with opioids. You're dying because you stop breathing, right? So fentanyl is more potent in that way. But in almost every other way that matters to a person who uses drugs and is dependent on drugs, has a substance use disorder, and uses opioids on an everyday basis. Fentanyl is a worse drug than heroin. It's inferior to heroin. And this is very important to think about and take into account, because when you hear that a substance is more potent than another one, you immediately imagine that it gives you a more satisfying effect, that it lasts longer, that it's more addictive. That's absolutely not the case with fentanyl. Fentanyl is a worse drug. The most important way in which it is an inferior drug to heroin is that it lasts much less. It has a shorter metabolic half-life than heroin, and that is a huge problem for people who use drugs, because it means that you develop withdrawal symptoms much faster. You get dope sick much faster. For a person who is unhoused, who doesn't have a regular income, this is the majority of the people that I work with, getting dope sick faster and the drug wearing off sooner means that you have to buy more, you have to use more, you have to find more money to go and buy more drugs, more fentanyl, more opioids to stave off withdrawal, right? This is a huge problem. Imagine also the impact that it has on drug use behaviors. A person begins to have to inject more frequently if they inject, because they, again, are developing withdrawal symptoms faster, right? In this way, it has always been very clear to people who had experience in the heroin era that fentanyl is a worse drug, not a better drug, right? Nobody switched to fentanyl because they liked it more. It just became the only opioid around. The other way that fentanyl is worse than heroin has to do with the very quality of the high, the very experience of use. People who were around in the 2000s and 90s and truly experienced what a pure heroin high felt like always insisted. This has become harder to study, by the way, because fentanyl has now been around for 13 years. So a lot of the people who have only been using in the last decade never really actually experienced a heroin high, a pure heroin high. Some think that they did, but they didn't. And so the temporal boundary between the heroin era and the fentanyl era kind of became blurred, and a lot of people don't even know what the actual difference is between a heroin high and a fentanyl high. But my research team and I were living in Kensington when this transformation happened, and we were able to talk to hundreds of people about the difference between, say, a pure heroin high and a fentanyl high. And everybody insisted that the fentanyl high was worse, that if heroin gave you kind of like a full body experience, fentanyl instead was localized in the face and the neck. People referred to it as a flushing feeling in the face, not nearly as satisfying as kind of the full body embrace that heroin provided. Thinking about all these ways that fentanyl is worse than heroin from the perspective of the people who use drugs is very important, because all those deficiencies of fentanyl, all those ways that fentanyl is inferior to heroin, opened up the space for the emergence of new substances, new additives, new adulterants like xylazine, like medetomidine, and even the increasing use of stimulants, all of which make up for some of the things that were lost in the transition from heroin to fentanyl. Some of the things that got worse in the transition from heroin to fentanyl are made up by these new substances that have emerged in the supply in recent years. We're going to come back to exactly how it is that these substances make up for fentanyl deficiencies. The next substance that came around was xylazine, right? This is the substance that is most similar to medetomidine, so we will pay a significant amount of attention to it. This has become more well known in recent years or months, but for those of you who are not familiar, I did want to briefly review xylazine's pharmacology. Xylazine is not a traditional mu opioid, right? It's not in the same family of drugs as heroin or fentanyl. It's in a completely different category of substances. It is, however, a sedative, a downer, right? I insist that it is most accurate or most helpful to think about it as a tranquilizer. It has been used by veterinaries for the treatment of animals for a very long time. Xylazine is basically an animal tranquilizer. right? It puts mammals asleep, right, including humans, for very long periods of time. The first place where it was detected in the opiate supply was actually in Puerto Rico. For many years during the 2000s, xylazine was mixed into the Puerto Rican heroin supply. And to this day, we owe much of what we know about xylazine to the Puerto Rican public health researchers and harm reduction service providers who studied the impact of xylazine on people who use drugs, predominantly among people who injected drugs in Puerto Rico. And as a result, Puerto Rican scholars were the first to write about the new types of skin wounds that xylazine produced when people used xylazine in high concentrations. They were the first to document the long periods of sedation that people would fall into after consuming xylazine, right? Medetomidine is a much more recent arrival. Reports of its emergence started actually in the state of Maryland in 2022. In my own drug checking program in Philadelphia, we did not start detecting it until April 2024. And really, medetomidine started becoming more common when xylazine began to be scheduled and criminalized more strictly. Medetomidine is exactly in the same family of substances as xylazine. It's an alpha-2 adrenergic agonist. It's also used as an animal tranquilizer, um, but it is more potent than xylazine. When xylazine started to get more expensive and harder to get because the government started prohibiting it more strictly, suppliers switched to medetomidine as an alternative, right? This is why prohibition never works, right? Prohibition always causes a shift to a substance that is going to be more potent and more toxic, unfortunately, right? Medetomidine actually has been used in clinical contexts for a very long time, predominantly among vets, right, for the treatment of animals. It was approved by the FDA in 1987. One of its components, which is really kind of like it's called an enantiomer, right? It's kind of like a substance that has the same chemical composition as the other, but it has a different spatial layout. The atoms are distributed differently, and that different configuration of the compound causes a different impact or an effect on the body of mammals or of humans, right? One of its enantiomers, dexmedetomidine, has been used for the treatment of humans for a very long time, since 1999, right? It was approved by the FDA, especially for sedating and tranquilizing people in the ICU, in the intensive care unit, who are intubated and mechanically ventilated. More recently, dexmedetomidine was used actually very successful for the treatment of xylazine withdrawal, which is a very important phenomenon to keep in mind. Each one of these substances develops a new type of dependence. When a person stops using the opiates that are available on the street, they begin to develop new types of withdrawal symptoms. People nowadays are not only withdrawing from fentanyl, from an opioid, they're also withdrawing from xylazine and medetomidine and whatever else is present in their local supply, right? And so a lot of clinical research and medical work is going into figuring out how best to treat the withdrawal, combined fentanyl, xylazine, medetomidine withdrawal, right? And dexmedetomidine emerged very quickly as a successful method to treat xylazine withdrawal in particular, right? So you can see how complex these developments are in the opioid supply, because many times the adulterants that pop up in the supply are actually fully legitimate medical medications, right? Fully legitimate medications that are frequently used in the hospital clinical context. To give you an idea of how prevalent xylazine and medetomidine are in the current supply, in the current opiate supply, I wanted to give you some data from Philadelphia, where I do most of my research. In 2022, the average dope sample, this is kind of how like the opioid Opiates are referred to in the street, right? Dope is kind of like the all-encompassing word to refer to whatever is in the local supply in all its combinations, usually a combination of fentanyl, xylazine, and medetomidine. But in 2022, before the emergence of medetomidine in Philadelphia, the average dope sample consisted of 2 to 10% fentanyl, 30 to 40% xylazine, and no heroin, right? So in 2022, xylazine was the bulk of the substance that people were using when they were using dope in Philadelphia, right? The data from 2025, which is my most recent data, comes from my own drug checking project that I conduct with harm reduction organization and 50 Savage Sisters. We're doing heroic work, really taking care of people who use drugs. Most of them are unhoused. We collaborate in this drug checking project together, collecting samples on the streets, shipping them to a lab, getting the information back to harm reduction service providers, public health officials, and the people who use drugs themselves, right? So that they are aware of what's in their dope. So in January 2025, the average dope bag that we collected contained 1.7% fentanyl. Notice how diluted the fentanyl is, how low the concentration of fentanyl is, right? 20.9% xylazine, 9.7% medetomidine, 5.4% PTEMs, which is another new adulterant that we're going to talk about in a minute. And interestingly, a growing amount of local anesthetics like lidocaine and tetracaine, which had never been present in the opioid supply before. Sometimes you would find it in the cocaine supply. Cocaine is also a local anesthetic, and lidocaine and tetracaine somewhat mimic the effect of cocaine on numbing the skin or the mouth or whatever part of the body comes into contact with it. So it was these were common adulterants in the cocaine supply for many years, but we have never really seen them in the opioid supply. They're becoming increasingly common, and they don't seem to have terrible effects on the health of people who use drugs, but they are sometimes present in such high concentrations that they can be toxic, right? They're poisonous not necessarily because of intrinsic characteristics, but because of how much of the substance is present in the supply, right? But I wanted to also share data from March 2025 so that you see the variability and the rapidity with which, the quickness with which the supply changes, right? In a space of 2 months, the average dope bag that we collected went from having 1.7% fentanyl to having 5.3% fentanyl. It went from having 20.9% xylazine to having 0.3% xylazine. Medetomidine stayed relatively the same. PTEMs dropped significantly. Local anesthetics, lidocaine and tetracaine, remain essentially the same, right? But this is why it's so important for every locality in the country to have a drug checking project, so that a robust drug checking program, so that you know what is in your supply almost on an everyday basis, or at least on a week-to-week, month-by-month basis, so that you can respond accordingly, because each one of these substances is going to have a different impact on the health of people who use drugs, and is definitely going to require a different type of services. I was able to find some data from Maryland showing essentially that medetomidine, xylazine is just as prevalent in the state of Maryland as it is in the state of Pennsylvania. There are ways that the reporting of this data could be significantly improved, but essentially this governmental data shows that the supply in Philadelphia looks relatively similar to Maryland's, right? There's always going to be local variations. There's always going to be temporal variations from week to week and month to month. But generally speaking, we're all in our region dealing with the same substances, the same adulterants. Now, I did want to go back to the idea that these new substances are helping to make up for the deficiencies of fentanyl, for the ways that fentanyl is worse than heroin. Like that, this is one of the reasons for the staying power of these new adulterants. And I always go back to this conversation that I had with a person who injects drugs in Philadelphia back in early 2021, where he basically showed me that people already had a very sophisticated understanding of the differences between fentanyl, heroin, and xylazine, and the way that xylazine was helping to make up for fentanyl's deficiencies, right? The ways that fentanyl is worse than heroin. And so this is a person I named Tom. This is a pseudonym, right? Tom uses both heroin, both opioids and methamphetamine. And when I asked him what, sorry, by the way, I have not been keeping track of the chat, so I apologize that I missed some questions. But yes, I'm happy to circulate the slides. I think, oh yeah, okay, Aisha already addressed this. But yeah, I'm very happy to share the slides and also my email for those of you who want to get in touch with any questions. So this person had already a very, very sophisticated understanding of the differences between all these substances, and I like to read out this quote. So Tom said, fentanyl is such a short-lived high, right? The first thing he did was complain about fentanyl, right? This was March 2021, by the way, right? Over 4 years ago. Fentanyl is such a short-lived high that the high, it's a good high, but it's so short that the nod, kind of like the effect of the relaxing effect, for those of you who are not as familiar with, with the lingo among people who use drugs, the nod is over real quick and you get sicker faster, right? You get dope sick faster. Withdrawal comes on faster. And also, apparently, withdrawal is worse. You get sicker. It's not just that you get sick faster, you get sicker faster. See, the trank was already the slang term for xylazine, right? Xylazine is a tranquilizer. So the slang term that emerged very quickly was trank. See, the trank extends the high. It gives the dope more of a heroin effect. It's a good rush with a heroin like legs. Legs is a word that is commonly used to refer to the duration of the high. But they straight put bags out there that are just all trank, all xylazine. You shoot it, you feel no rush. Trank fent, there's already a term for the combination of xylazine and fentanyl. Trank fent is like you shoot it, you inject it, you get the rush of the fentanyl, then the tranquilizer comes in, you nod, and you fall asleep. A straight trank bag is like you shoot it, you get no rush, you're sitting there for a second talking, and then you're waking up 2 to 3 hours later in a weird position. Like one case, I lit a Newport, right, a menthol cigarette. I shot a bag with a Newport. I woke up with a whole of Newport burnt into my stomach. You could literally drown in a half-inch of water if you did a trank bag and you fell out, right? So notice again how sophisticated already and complex the understanding is of the differences between all these drugs, the pros and the cons of all of them, right? He likes things about each of the drugs, dislike things about each of them too, right? He appreciates from the xylazine that it helps to stave off withdrawal. It extends the high, it staves off dope sickness, right? This is very important again for an unhoused person. This person is unhoused, by the way, right? For an unhoused person who's not a millionaire. If you are not getting dope sick as fast, not only are you, well, number one, you're not going through the torture of withdrawal, right? This is a very important thing to understand. Withdrawal, dope sickness is a torturous experience that you do not wish on your worst enemy, right? Withdrawal is enemy number one for a person who uses drugs and has a substance use disorder, right? So the fact that xylazine staves off withdrawal is a godsend. It means you don't feel torture, and also you don't have to buy as much drugs. You don't have to go and make money to buy again, right? This is clearly a welcome development. But Tom is also recognizing all the downsides of trank, right? Number one, it doesn't give you a rush. Experientially, it's not very good. Like, like it doesn't give you a euphoric effect like most other substances in the supply do. Those 20 to 30 seconds of euphoria that people experience when they consume traditional opioids or stimulants, trank doesn't give that to you. Trank is a more flatline experience, right? You kind of just consume it, don't really even notice that it's there, and suddenly you're asleep, right? People do not like that. Also, if you're unhoused, it means that you're falling asleep in awkward positions in potentially dangerous places, right? People are getting robbed more frequently. Women are experiencing more prevalence of sexual assault. So xylazine introduces all these complications that we did not have to think about before. in the era of heroin, right? And Tom already recognizes that, right? Kind of the pros and the cons of this transformation in the supply. Again, new dangers. If you fall asleep with a cigarette, you're going to burn yourself with a cigarette, right? Uh, if you fall asleep, you could drown in a half inch of water, right? So as I said, xylazine might have some welcome or might have triggered some welcome transformations, particularly in extending withdrawal or staving off withdrawal. But it has also introduced all kinds of major changes. And this is very important when we think about medetomidine, because medetomidine is in the exact same family of drugs as xylazine. So a lot of these transformations, a lot of these impacts on public health and on the health of people who use drugs are going to be the same. Right? So the deep sedation, especially that people experience after consuming xylazine, that's exactly the same for xylazine as for medetomidine. In fact, medetomidine sedates people even more severely, right? People fall asleep for very long periods of time. They're tranquilized, right? And this is very important for thinking about overdose prevention in the era of synthetic substances like fentanyl, xylazine, and medetomidine, because it has become increasingly difficult to distinguish between a potentially fatal overdose and xylazine and medetomidine sedation, right? Many people who are not very skillful at distinguishing between the two um, rush to believe that they are seeing a potentially fatal overdose when really all they're seeing is a person who is undergoing the sedative effects of a tranquilizer like xylazine and medetomidine. And this is very important actually, because it's a very complicated, nuanced point that has to be addressed very carefully, because it has to do with Narcan and naloxone and how frequently naloxone is administered. Narcan and naloxone are very important because they help to reverse a fentanyl overdose. The great majority of fatal overdoses among people who use opioids today, even with all these changes in the supply, are really fentanyl overdoses. There are very good studies out there now showing that xylazine actually has no impact on the likelihood of suffering a potential overdose. That fentanyl really continues to be the driver of the overdose, and naloxone is the drug that reverses um, a fentanyl overdose, right, or an opioid overdose. So naloxone continues to be very important, but it's also very important not to administer it unnecessarily. There's a lot of research going into the negative impact on the body of administering Narcan unnecessarily, repeatedly, right? And this happens a lot to unhoused people who use drugs, because paramedics arrive, they're not very skilled actually, they're not very adept at distinguishing between a potential overdose and xylazine or medetomidine sedation, and they just rush to administer the Narcan and leave, right? And naloxone sends a person into precipitated withdrawal. It's a shock on the body, right? It sends the person into this torturous experience that we spoke about earlier, opioid withdrawal. Some research is finding that repeated precipitated withdrawal has a harmful effect on internal organs. So paramedics who think that they're saving lives by administering naloxone are sometimes actually ultimately slowly helping to kill the person, right? So the use of naloxone has to be much more careful actually than it has become in the last decade. And the harm reduction service providers are coming up with very innovative, creative protocols for helping people distinguish between a potentially fatal overdose and just xylazine sedation, right? Pulse oximeters have become very important. The pulse oximeter is the little machine that we all became familiar with during the COVID era to measure kind of how much oxygen is in our blood, right? If the level of oxygen falls beneath 90, below 90, it means that you're not breathing properly, and that some kind of rescue needs to be undertaken, right? Harm reduction service providers are shifting the focus really from naloxone to rescue breathing, focusing especially on the importance of providing rescue breathing, staying with the person for as long as they need to fully recover their ability to breathe. And when they use naloxone, they're actually starting to use more diluted, lower doses of naloxone because they found that these myths about fentanyl requiring more naloxone or more powerful doses of naloxone are absolutely mistaken. They're wrong. They're simply wrong. You do not need more concentrated or heavier doses of naloxone. In fact, you need less naloxone and more rescue breathing. Now, I am not a clinician, I am not a service provider, and I cannot provide you the details of how to undertake kind of an overdose reversal in the current era, but I do have um, very good references to articles and very good resources that might help you um, think about how to do this. And yes, for one thing, that this is an important question in the chat, right? If you are not skilled in distinguishing between a xylazine sedation and a potentially fatal overdose, you should go ahead and administer naloxone, right? Like if you do not know kind of what you're doing, I think it's safest to administer naloxone. But for people who are first responders, who are doing this on an everyday basis at a high volume, those people need to become much more adept at like paramedics, for example, right? Or nurses or clinicians. They need to become much more adept uh, to prevent all the harmful consequences of administering naloxone unnecessarily repeated. Yes, and the references in the slides will include the articles on what harm reductionists are calling compassionate overdose reversal in the current era, right? This is how it's being framed among people in public health, the need for compassionate overdose reversal. Okay, so moving on to other health issues related to xylazine and medetomidine. Xylazine has also created a skin wound crisis, especially among people who inject or snort opioids. We're gonna talk a little bit more about that. We spoke about the fact that xylazine and medetomidine sedation has increased the risk of sexual assault and robbery, right? Especially among unhoused people who are falling asleep in public spaces for extended periods of time. The treatment of withdrawal and detox has been completely transformed by the emergence of these new substances. Clinicians have found that you cannot treat a person undergoing xylazine, fentanyl, medetomidine withdrawal the same way that you used to treat a person who was undergoing a heroin withdrawal or fentanyl withdrawal, right? When a person comes into the hospital for the treatment of endocarditis or a skin wound that they need to be taken in for extended periods of time, they generally need to be treated for withdrawal. And so clinicians are developing novel protocols that have proven to be successful for the treatment of combined fentanyl, xylazine, medetomidine withdrawal. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a later slide. Initiation, MOUD initiation into methadone and buprenorphine has also been transformed. Again, I'm not a clinician, and that's one thing that we're not going to be able to talk about today. But in my slides, there are going to be useful references and resources related to MOUD initiation in the era of xylazine and medetomidine. One thing that's very important that requires work among service providers and researchers in every town and city in the country has to do with the question of dose response. Are the health impacts of xylazine and medetomidine the same on people who use drugs in places where those substances are present in high concentrations versus places where those substances are present in low concentrations, right? In Philadelphia, we find all these substances in very high concentrations. And a lot of the research has revolved around places like Philly, right? Sadly, Philly is a little overrepresented. I acknowledge that. I'm the first one to acknowledge that we get a little bit too much attention and the rest of the region doesn't, right? It's very important to pay attention to the places where the supply might contain the same substances, but in lower concentrations. And it's very likely that in cities like Baltimore, even, or, or rural parts of Maryland, etc., these substances are going to be present. Xylazine and medetomidine are going to be present, but in lower concentrations. Is the wound crisis the same in those places? Is the question of withdrawal, the treatment of withdrawal, the same in those places? It's likely to be very different. And that's research that, I can't do, right? Like folks like you are going to have to take the lead in that. One thing that I did want to stop and talk about has to do with the skin wound crisis. Xylazine causes these novel skin wounds that are very different from the traditional heroin or fentanyl abscess. Xylazine wounds are not abscesses. Abscesses are infections from the beginning, generally caused by a person injecting bacteria or some kind of extraneous substance, a piece of cotton, for example, into the skin. Xylazine wounds are not bacterial infections at the beginning. They are wounds the way that a cut or a gash is a wound. And the dominant hypothesis for why they emerge, what causes these wounds, is that xylazine is a very potent vasoconstrictor. That means that xylazine restricts the flow of blood and oxygen to the skin, and that results in the death of skin tissue. The skin simply does not get all the blood and the oxygen that it needs to survive, and it begins to die, and that causes a wound. Um, After the wound emerges, especially among people who are unhoused and don't have access to showers, it's common for the wound to get infected, and these wounds can become very, very big and problematic. They can lead to amputations. They can lead to sepsis, bacterial infections of the blood that can be fatal, right? And there's all kinds of things that have to do with xylazine's property as a vasoconstrictor that lead to transformations in the way that in which people use drugs, things that people cannot control. They're properties of the substance, of the drug, that cause major changes to the way that a person uses drugs. So because xylazine is such a vasoconstrictor, it restricts the flow of blood and oxygen to the skin and to veins. People lose access to their veins in their arms and their legs very quickly. People who have been injecting into their arms for years all of a sudden become unable to do so. They simply cannot find the vein anymore. Their veins get shot, as they say in the street, right? That leads to major transformations in the way that people inject drugs or use drugs. It leads to people skin popping more frequently, injecting directly into skin instead of into a vein, injecting directly in muscling, they're injecting into muscle tissue instead of injecting into a vein, right? Back when I lived in Philadelphia in the heroin era between 2008 and 2012, I never saw anybody skin pop or muscle. It was considered a waste. People wanted to feel the direct effect by injecting into a vein. Now, almost everybody is at some point injecting directly into skin, and that contributes to the skin wound crisis. It's more likely for a person to develop the wounds when they inject directly into skin tissue, especially when they begin injecting directly into a wound. Now, I'm gonna have to skip a few of these because I realize we're running out of time. I do want to have enough time for a Q&A. I want to get to medetomidine. One important thing to keep in mind is that people who exclusively smoke appear to be generally protected from the development of the wounds. At this point, I've spoken to dozens of people who smoke, and none of them develop the type of wounds that people who inject or people who snort do. People who snort, interestingly, develop problems in the respiratory tract. So the direct contact of xylazine with skin is clearly having a toxic effect. Smoking appears to be protective, at least in relation to skin wounds. And as a result, many people in Philadelphia are switching from injection to smoking. And it's something to consider in the field of harm reduction, whether or not to encourage people to consider that shift to prevent the formation of xylazine wounds, right? Preventing amputation in the long run, preventing sepsis. Now, smoking is not going to be an ideal solution, right? There's all kinds of risks that are also associated to smoking that will have to be taken into account. It's not, you're going to be trading some problems for others. It really is not going to be like a panacea. But at least in relation to wound formation, it does seem to be a successful method of harm reduction. Something else to take into account when thinking about the wound crisis is the increasing use of stimulants like cocaine, crack, and methamphetamine among people who use drugs everywhere in the United States over the past decade. Because this is a widely documented phenomenon that when people start using stimulants regularly, they develop the compulsion of to pick their skin. And so picking at wounds is very common and definitely an additional contributor to the skin wound crisis. Now, medetomidine is very interesting because even though it's in the same family of drugs as xylazine and has many of the same effects of xylazine in terms of sedation, in terms of withdrawal, initiation into buprenorphine and methadone, it does not seem to be as potent a vasoconstrictor. It does not seem to be contributing to the skin wound crisis as much. So again, this is why it's so important to pay attention to the details about these substances, right? You might think that you're talking about essentially the same substance, but really a minor change in the chemical composition of a substance or a minor difference in the chemical composition of a substance is going to have a different effect on the body in relation to wounds or in relation to hepatitis C or the likelihood of HIV infection or the likelihood of an overdose, the effect on the withdrawal experience and the treatment of withdrawal, right? You really, really have to think about the details. You cannot go for kind of like the broad strokes when you think about substance use. So one major difference between xylazine and medetomidine seems to be wounds. Medetomidine is not as toxic to the skin. Oh, I'm sorry. I meant to warn you that I was going to show you a photo of a common xylazine wound in Philadelphia. For those of you who might not be familiar, to have an idea of, again, this is not even close to the worst wound I've seen, right? This is a common wound in Philadelphia. If you're squeamish, please do feel free to look away. I just think it's important for people to see them to realize, right? This is what a xylazine wound looks like. Yeah. So with medetomidines arrival only 2 years ago, or only a year ago in Philadelphia, the most significant change, the most significant impact on the health of people who use drugs has been the experience of withdrawal. People who work in emergency rooms or who work as clinicians will tell you gruesome stories about emergency rooms over the past year. The experience of withdrawal among people who use opioids has gotten much worse. People have developed much worse symptoms. They're harder to get stabilized, predominantly because medetomidine withdrawal produces profound autonomic dysfunction. So all the functions of the body that happened unconsciously, right? Blood flow, heart rate, metabolism, digestion, all those things are deeply disturbed in the experience of medetomidine withdrawal, specifically medetomidine withdrawal. This did not happen with xylazine, but with medetomidine, it's people who work in emergency rooms and ICUs in hospitals describe the situation as essentially out of control. People need to be intubated not because of respiratory depression, not because of weakened breathing, as in the past with fentanyl or heroin or with traditional opioids. They need to be intubated because of intractable vomiting. A person cannot stop vomiting, so they cannot breathe, right? Other symptoms that have been documented widely are metabolic acidosis. The blood becomes dangerously acidic. Just so that you see that the impact that this is having kind of on hospital and clinical resources, right? In a study of 165 patients in Philadelphia who arrived at a hospital suffering withdrawal or between September 2024 and January 2025, 91% required referral to the ICU, right? This is a major transformation to the experience of withdrawal and to kind of the context of hospital care, right? 24% of these 165 patients had to be intubated, mostly because of intractable vomiting, right? Now, the good news, I suppose, is that treatment protocols involving dexmedetomidine infusions, the same drug that proved successful in the treatment of xylazine withdrawal is proving to be very successful in the treatment of medetomidine withdrawal. Now, the issue is just the severe kind of increase in the need for hospital resources, and also in the torturous symptomatology of withdrawal itself, right? And withdrawal now, in fact, can be fatal, right? Possibly for the first time well, at least since I have been doing research on opioids in the United States, withdrawal can truly be fatal. You do hear in Philadelphia reports among harm reduction service providers who work with this population day in and day out, that people died in a jail cell overnight when they got taken in and suffered withdrawal, and they weren't given anything to treat their withdrawal symptoms, right? Correctional officers simply assumed that they were seeing what they have always seen, a person detoxing cold turkey of opioids. But really, this new experience of withdrawal is much more different and much more disturbing to the body. How does this show up? You mean medetomidine? How does it show up on a drug test? Generally speaking, actually, it's they test for metabolites of medetomidine, and apparently medetomidine actually is very quickly metabolized and will not show up on many drug tests, but the metabolites do show up, and that is how they document it in these studies. For example, this one that I cite here, you're gonna have access to it in the references when I send you the slides. Yeah, so this is the most important concern. If the most important concern of the xylazine era was sedation and skin wounds, the most important concern of the medetomidine era has really been withdrawal and the treatment of withdrawal. And again, the resources I'm going to share with you provide some guidance on treatment protocols for a person suffering opioid and xylazine and medetomidine withdrawal all at the same time, which is really kind of what your patient population is going to be suffering when they suffer through withdrawal in this era, right? Nobody can escape any of these substances, really. That's just what the supply is. One thing to keep in mind also is that there's another adulterant in town, right? BTEMS. This is a substance that has long been used in plastic manufacturing to protect plastics from decay when exposed to the sun or to the heat. We do not understand very well why this substance is being used as an adulterant, but we started finding it in not just in Philadelphia, but in drug checking programs throughout the country, including Maryland, Delaware, and even Puerto Rico in the summer of 2024, so about a year ago. This is actually the first adulterant that showed up everywhere in the country exactly at the same time, right? Earlier, I told you about how fentanyl actually spread very unevenly, how it was a East Coast phenomenon for a very long time before it was a West Coast phenomenon. The same with xylazine, the same with medetomidine. BTEMS is the first substance that we find everywhere, that emerged everywhere at the same time. We're still trying to understand why that is the case. But the only studies that really we can refer to to think about what the health impact of this new substance is on the health of people who use drugs is several studies on rats, right? Rats are not humans, so it's not necessarily going to be the case that these studies will indicate what a human will suffer when consuming BTEMs in high concentrations over a period of time. But we are seeing reports in Philadelphia of some health consequences that are similar to those that are reported in rat studies, predominantly related to heart and eye ocular conditions that I had never seen before. I'm happy to provide you data from my own study about how prevalent this substance is and what concentrations it's showing up in Philadelphia. But so to finish, I wanted to help think more broadly about what the ultimate consequences of all these transformations are going to be on the health of people who use drugs. because it is very important to keep in mind that each one of these changes, each one of these substances that emerge is going to have a different impact on each of the health outcomes in each of the morbidities that we care about. Each one is going to have a different impact on HIV rates, on HCV rates, on overdoses, on skin wounds, on the treatment of withdrawal, right? Some are actually going to have a counterintuitively protective effect related to some of these morbidities, right? I like to give the example of xylazine and medetomidine because it's very counterintuitive. People always rush to kind of like the scandalizing narrative that everything is always getting worse and overdoses will always get worse. But actually, some things counterintuitively get better with these transformations. Xylazine and medetomidine is a good example because we mentioned that xylazine and medetomidine help to stave off opioid withdrawal. That has clearly led to people consuming less opioids and less dope on a daily basis than before xylazine came into the picture. We have actually worked very hard to document and quantify the extent to which people's volume of consumption, their daily volume of consumption of dope, has decreased thanks to the emergence of xylazine and medetomidine. And the average actually is almost around a third. People are using about a third of the amount of dope bags than they used to in Philadelphia before xylazine and medetomidine came into the picture. That means they're spending less money. That means they're injecting less frequently. And some of us even think that this is a potential contributor to the decrease in fentanyl overdoses that we have been documenting nationwide over the past couple of years. People are actually using less dope thanks to the emergence of xylazine, right? Now, xylazine is also causing all these other problems related to skin wounds, sepsis, deaths by sepsis, which were very uncommon before xylazine came into the picture. All these complications related to withdrawal, right? So it's not that things are just getting better. It's just that you have to think in very complex ways about each of the different morbidities and health outcomes that we care about and how the different drugs that are emerging, the different substances that are emerging are going to impact those things in different ways, right? You really can't rush to the scandalizing narrative. You always have to come back to the details. Right. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that the explosion of stimulant consumption, that in many ways is a reaction to the changes in the opioid supply. When you ask a person why they started using meth recently, by the way, back when I lived in Philadelphia in the heroin era between 2008 and 2012, I never even saw meth. Meth was not available in drug corners where heroin and cocaine dominated. Now it's available in about a third of those corners. And when you ask people why they started buying it, why they started liking it, they tell you that they're trying to counteract the sedation, the tranquilizing effect of xylazine and medetomidine, right? So that's kind of one of the main reasons that people are switching to stimulants. People are also very unsatisfied with the opioids that are available in the opioid supply. There's too little fentanyl in the opioids, right? Nobody's really getting kind of like the sedative effect that they want. And stimulants actually are very pure and cheap right now throughout the United States. Cocaine and methamphetamine are actually remarkably pure, especially in comparison to the opioid supply. So people often are switching to stimulant use almost as a question of quality. It's the only drug that is giving people a satisfying effect, right? So while the changes in the opioid supply might have some protective impacts, right, related to like the decrease in overdoses that we're seeing nationwide and whatnot, it's important to keep in mind this other transformation, which is kind of the explosion in stimulant use, which is producing health issues that are specific to stimulants, right? Cocaine and methamphetamine use, especially methamphetamine use, are strongly associated to HIV infection, psychostimulant overdose deaths deriving from cocaine, crack, and methamphetamine use have exploded throughout the country. I mean, 1,300% between 2012 and 2022, right? So something to keep in mind when people focus a little bit too much on what's happening in the opioids, right? We also want to always think about what's happening in the stimulant supply. Most people today are actually using both. um, so looking ahead, what are some of the things that we can do kind of to address the issues and the challenges related to all these transformations in the supply? I am a strong advocate of overdose prevention centers, sometimes known as safe consumption sites. It's important to keep in mind that in this era, overdose prevention centers would not only help reduce overdoses, they would also help reduce and prevent sexual assault. Remember that people are consuming substances that are going to tranquilize them, that are going to make them fall asleep in public for extended periods of time. And so having safe places for people to consume will help prevent these challenges, right? I am a strong advocate of the democratization of drug checking. I think every community in the country should have access to a lab that allows them to test the exact chemical composition of the substance that is available in the local supply. Is there a lot of xylazine or less xylazine? Is there a lot of medetomidine or less? Is there more fentanyl or less fentanyl in your local supply, right? Your supply is not going to look like Philadelphia's. It's not going to look like New York's. It's not going to look like San Francisco's. You need to know what your supply looks like locally to be able to respond accordingly. And you can only really do that through a partnership with a lab, right? And let me leave it at that because I've spoken for a long time and I do want to make sure that we have time for questions. But thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Montero. If anyone have any specific questions they would like to ask, feel free to raise your hand and you can come off mute or you can put them in the chat.
Appreciate the nice words.
But Marlon, I see that your hand is raised, so I'll let you go first.
Hello. I have a question. Is there medetomidine testing strips available for harm reduction?
There are actually, yes. Access to them does vary state by state. Some states provide them free of charge and have mailing services for them, but not all do, right? And medetomidine are probably the newest type of strip that is available. So I actually am sorry, but I don't know how to access them. But maybe, a Google search might help. If not, you could talk to your local harm reduction organization. I don't know if you might be in a harm reduction organization already. But I'm sure they would be informed, and if not, they can definitely reach out to me or the ATTC, and we can help link them to the strips. That's actually a strip. It's an important question because there's a big debate about how useful test strips are, right? Like fentanyl test strips are actually a very limited use to people who use opioids because that's the opioid that's around. Like that's just they're always going to be positive. There's not much you can do, right? And a person who has a disorder and wants to avoid withdrawal needs to use the opioid that's available to them no matter what, right? So there's limited utility to them. But with medetomidine, I think it could be relatively useful because not every supply, not every batch has it, right? And that's one drug that you could potentially avoid with, and test strips could help you with that, for sure. Karen Douglas.
Hi, thank you. It was a great presentation. And I'm wondering if you see any difference in the response to treatment between from the okay, help me out, and fentanyl different from heroin.
100%, yeah. And I'm sorry that I'm not a clinician and I cannot give you a lot of details, right? I can tell you my experience from the perspective of people on the street that I talk to, right? Like, well, all the people that I talk to are really the unhoused folks who use drugs. And what I know about treatment really comes from them. Of course, I read the articles and I go, that's my job. But again, I don't prescribe MOUD. I don't prescribe buprenorphine or methadone. So I wouldn't be able to give you the details of how to initiate a person or induct a person into each one of these substances in the current era. But one thing I can tell you is that one of the major transformations from the heroin era and now is that people are much more drawn to methadone now than they used to. Back in the heroin era, the people I worked with hated methadone above all things. Everybody wanted to get on buprenorphine or Suboxone. In Puerto Rico, they called Suboxone back then La Milagrosa, the miraculous one, because it was the only MOUD medication that would allow you to wean off of opioids without going through withdrawal if you dosed it correctly. And people have become very good and very adept at dosing the Suboxone gradually to avoid withdrawal. And almost in Philly, in fact, most people who were actively using heroin had Suboxone in their back pocket in case they weren't able to get money that day to find heroin. And, they could just lick the Suboxone for a little bit, and that would stave off withdrawal for an extended period of time. It was a lifesaver. Whereas methadone, you had to go to the clinic every day, right? It was harder to access than it is now. People called it liquid handcuffs, right? Like that was just a universal refrain in the heroin era. Now, in the fentanyl era, everybody that I know, I mean, the great majority of people want methadone instead of buprenorphine because of how tricky it has gotten to dose buprenorphine adequately to induct a person, help them wean off from fentanyl, and and get initiated into buprenorphine. There's many excellent doctors and clinicians and nurses out there and service providers out there who are successful in initiating people into buprenorphine and have no problems, but there are enough that don't know exactly what they're doing that a lot of patients have trouble in the induction process, specifically with bup and Suboxone. And so it's just given bup kind of a bad rep in this era. Among the people that I work with in both Philadelphia and in Puerto Rico, I have been shocked at how the perspective on that has changed dramatically from the heroin era to now. There's other things that have to do with fentanyl, about fentanyl specifically, because fentanyl, even though it wears off faster, right? It brings on withdrawal faster than heroin, like as I was saying in the presentation. Even though that's the case, there's some studies showing that fentanyl hangs around in the body, especially in body fat. And so even though a person doesn't feel it because the fentanyl is actually just attached to the fat and not to a receptor in the central nervous system, it still affects how effective buprenorphine will be. There's a lot of work, clinical research going into that, right? Like, I think it's mostly a debate that's still relatively unsettled, but I think that adds to the complications to buprenorphine initiation in this era, right? And so the reason why people are just kind of switching to methadone and liking methadone more now is because there's less issues around initiation, right? People are placed on methadone, given methadone, and they are satisfied with the treatment, they are able to stay on and not feel withdrawal for extended period of time. Also, methadone is a relatively potent opioid that satisfies the increased tolerance that people have in the fentanyl era, right? People have a much higher tolerance now in the fentanyl era now than in the heroin era. And methadone does seem to have the required punch to help a person who's going through fentanyl withdrawal, right? Whereas in the heroin era, it was kind of a little bit like overkill. Methadone was a little more. Methadone was overkill, yeah, and it was considered maybe too sedating, right? Yeah. So I think it's a really interesting question actually, and one that could be looked at more closely by researchers, service providers. Well, just long story short, people like methadone more in the current era than they used to. It seems to be very successful. And yeah, and that has everything to do with the switch from heroin to fentanyl.
Looks like we have two More questions in the chat as of right now. The first one is, what does the overdose prevention centers consist of and how does it work?
Yeah, so overdose prevention centers are also is also known as safe consumption sites, right? They are places, very regulated, carefully designed places, often staffed by nurses and other medical clinicians, in addition to outreach workers and people with living experience of using drugs, where people can come in and use substances safely without having to worry about dying of an overdose or having all the um, complications that might result from using the supply in this current era, right? They might also get access to treatment, linkage to treatment, MOUD, other types of medical care they need in those places, right? In the United States, the only ones that exist and that run officially, above ground, let's say, are in New York City. On Point is the organization that runs the two most well-known overdose prevention centers. I actually don't know if a few have opened in other places. I know Rhode Island had plans for one. Philly had plans for one. It got shut down. um, these types of spaces exist mostly in Western Europe, Canada. There's a couple in Mexico actually that are very successful. Wherever they exist, they have been very well studied because they're very interested in proving that they're successful, that they're not just trying to encourage people to use drugs, that they're not like spoiling people who don't deserve care. And they have been very carefully studied, and they have systematically shown to lower overdose rates, to lower crime rates in surrounding areas, uh, increase and improve health outcomes and linkage to care. Um, Among people who use drugs in the places where they do exist. You can imagine that this is a very controversial topic, right? But I do think it's been definitively proven that they're successful. And it's just prejudice and ideology that prevents us from seeing that, right? They should be around everywhere. But they clearly are not. They're not. Yeah, I'm happy to go down the chat a little more.
The next question, how has the cost increased or decreased from the heroin to current opioid supply?
Oh, that's a very good question. Yeah. So the impact is different in different places, right? Philadelphia is really the only city where I know the answer very well. One big transformation that happened in the shift from heroin to fentanyl is that the average price of the dope bag in Philly went from $10 to $5. So now most bags cost $5, and you can even get $3 or $2 bags of dope, right? And I say dope because really that's the only effective term left, right? Because there's so many things in the supply that you need kind of like an all-encompassing term to refer to whatever is present in it, right? Yeah, so the price went down. Now, interestingly, people also started using less. You would imagine that because the price went down, people would start using more. But again, with the switch to xylazine, interestingly, people started using less. And I happen to also study people who work with people who sell drugs to understand how all these changes are affecting the drug market. And it is very clear that these transformations are leading to an economic crisis in drug corners, right? Often we assume that these transformations are increasing profits and making everything right better for sellers, but actually that is not the case. Xylazine and medetomidine have had a very counterintuitive, unexpected impact on the economics of drug markets, and they're actually very unprofitable. Um, um, that is likely to lead to further transformations in the supply in the next couple of years. Um, but yeah, and then it is true that all these substances are cheaper at a wholesale level for suppliers. Going back to your question, Tonia, fentanyl is definitely cheaper to produce than heroin. Xylazine is even cheaper, right? Medetomidine is even cheaper than xylazine, right? And this is really one of the reasons why prohibition and criminalization just doesn't work, right? Like when you prohibit a substance like heroin, suppliers are going to switch to something that's cheaper to produce, easier to smuggle, right? Easier to hide. That's why we moved from heroin to fentanyl. Fentanyl is easier to hide. It's more potent, so you require less volume to satisfy a larger demand. That means you have to smuggle less product to satisfy the same demand, right? The only reason you're trying to do that is because heroin is prohibited. Right? If heroin hadn't been prohibited, if it had been regulated, fentanyl would have never become a problem. Right? And then the switch to xylazine to medetomidine is very similar. You start criminalizing xylazine and prohibiting it more strictly. Suppliers switch to medetomidine. It's more potent. And ironically, it's cheaper too, right? Yeah. How do you think the new FRS bill? I'm sorry that I am have to. Can you remind me what the FRS bill is? I just moved to Philadelphia what, a month ago. It's been an eventful month. I'm a little out of date when it comes to current affairs. I'm sorry. um, oh, is it a bill trying to criminalize fentanyl related substances more strictly? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, in my experience and in in history, these changes have only ever made things worse, right? Like further criminalization only sounds good. It never improves conditions on the ground, right? Like suppliers will always find a way around the prohibition, and it usually entails bringing on substances that are more toxic and that are going to cause more problems. Um, yeah, yeah, and you know, the way to solve challenges related to substance use and substance selling is by solving inequality, right? Poverty, um, improving education, uh, investing in your people, right? This is how you solve a problem, not by throwing everybody in jail. Right? If you throw people in jail, they're just gonna learn to be better at doing prohibited things, right? I mean, I think that the historical record proves that absolutely definitively. There's no question about it. We've been trying criminalization and prohibition for over 50 years and things have only gotten worse. Like, why do we keep insisting on it? Ooh, yeah, Jason, it is difficult. I mean, I was lucky in that I got connected to a lab that already had permissions, even from like USPS, the Postal Service, to be able to ship samples. So I didn't have to deal with the red tape. Um, the advantage is that you really don't need that much of a substance to test it robustly, systematically. Like we use maybe 2 milligrams, tiny little microscope of a substance. So it usually is able to pass, you know, legal muster even, right? That amount of drugs is not even criminalized. You cannot be thrown in jail for having 2 milligrams of drugs in your possession. And so that's usually the way that you are able to get them off the ground. These programs are popping up everywhere in the country, and um, if you were interested in starting one or or learning more about how they work, I'm happy to talk. See you all. Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I mean, I'm happy to help your organizations if you're interested in further trainings. You know, pretty much anything related to substance use and changes in the supply, drug markets, uh, health outcomes related to substance use. Um, I'm happy to contribute and help.
Thank you all. Are there any last minute questions before we head out for the day? Mm.
Oh yeah, no, I haven't seen the antifreeze anywhere else. But again, that's why it's important, right? To have these drug checking programs and be able to conduct this kind of testing basically on a daily basis, right?
Well, thank you all for hanging in with us this afternoon. We really appreciate you guys participating, and this information has proven to be very useful for you guys. So please, if you haven't taken the evaluation, please do so and indicate that. We have no problem bringing Dr. Montero back to follow up on this topic or other topics. And please reach out to me. I'm going to put my email in the chat just in case you guys have any questions. You can reach out anytime. Or if you're thinking of any topics that you would like for us to explore, you can send that through email as well.
Thanks again for the invitation. This is
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you all.
See you.